Okay, should we talk about architecture now? This is a great age for architecture. We're going to primarily look at three things. This is really what defines 20th century modernism and architecture. Art Deco, which we won't spend too much time on because it's a small part of it. And in many ways, Art Deco is really a design style and not really an architectural style. But I do want to look at it because it's interesting in terms of its design and how it really connects 19th and 20th century. So we'll start with that. And then we'll spend time on the international style. That is what you think of when you think of modern architecture. If something comes into your mind, when I say that word, it's probably international style. It's largely, well, it's throughout the Western world. It's European. We'll look at three architects that really dominated the international style, both in Europe and in America. And then lastly, Prairie style, which is, of course, the unique American Frank Lloyd Wright interpretation of modernism, which is not international style. It's unique. It's American style, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Before we do that, though, I do want to talk a little bit about the beginning of the skyscraper and skyscraper construction, which really begins in the 19th century, but it changes dramatically in America with the modernist style of the 20th century. 19th century skyscrapers look decidedly different from 20th century skyscrapers, as we'll see. The term is very specific. It doesn't just refer to, a really tall building. I'm going to call it a skyscraper, but it's really a support system. It refers to a particular type of engineering in which the building is held in place by generally these days a steel skeleton or framework. And then the walls are generally not load bearing. They generally hang off that framework. And that's a new architectural design that we began seeing it in the 1870s when they were using iron skeleton framework. But then by the mid-80s, 1880s, they were using steel. They developed the new Bessemer steel process. Steel was much better than iron. It was fireproof. Steel, iron is not fireproof. I don't mean it'll burst into flame, but it will soften and become very weak if it burns. Steel is much stronger. So if there's a fire, the place isn't going to fall down necessarily if you have steel. So it is better for a number of reasons. But you've all seen buildings going up in process. You can walk almost anywhere in any city and see this exposed skeletal framework. And that's the important invention of the modern world, particularly the 19th. As we look at 19th century skyscrapers, however, and we're talking primarily in America, this is American engineering, skyscrapers are born in America, and the home of the skyscraper and modern architecture in general is Chicago. And we'll take a look at some buildings there in a minute. Yeah.
Is steel American with steel?
It's a Bessemer process. Yes, it's from Pennsylvania. Yeah, so it's an American process. So America had skyscrapers long before Europe did. However, what Americans didn't have was any sense of what they should look like. No sense of design. Well, this is a whole different structural form. So what should a building like this look like? And so in the 19th century, they kind of didn't have any idea. So they worked in what was called the eclectic style. And that's basically just revivalist. 19th century American architecture is largely revivalist, neoclassical, neo-Renaissance, neo-something European, because Americans looked at that style and wanted to emulate that. I mean, there are reasons why American courthouses and so many official buildings in America look like, classical Greek temples and Renaissance buildings. There was a conscious attempt to connect to a tradition that America didn't have. America didn't have history and tradition and all of that. So let's tap into that as a sort of metaphor for empire in a way. So we end up with a lot of buildings like the one you see here, which have, look like they have sort of Greek columns. I know this is blurry. You don't see it very well, but these are sort of giant Greek columns up at the top, or they'll have things like Gothic arches. They're just borrowing from the past. I have to tell you about this competition because it's one of my favorite moments in architecture, and that is the Tribune Tower competition. In 1922, the owners of the Chicago Tribune were going to build a new building in downtown Chicago, and they had a competition and invited architects from all around the world to submit plans for this new building. And the only thing they said was that it had to be the most beautiful building in the world. And I love this because it tells you what people thought at that moment was beauty. And I just have a few of the designs. I mean, some of them are absolutely incredible. Most of these are European architects. So we're playing on what they think of America and what they think America thinks is beautiful. And some of them are absolutely bizarre, but these are major architects and they're very serious designs, as bizarre as they seem, like this Adolf Loos design of the giant Greek column, the Italian design that has the giant sort of arch, which is very Italian. I see that as very Italian. And I love this Bush design. I mean, that's just so totally bizarre. I like the Tout design because at least it's not a revivalist design. It's something I've never seen before. It was modern in every way. It still looks odd to my eye, but at least it is a modern design. The building that won was the Howells and Hood building. And this was everyone's idea of the most beautiful building in the world. It still stands. It really is a beautiful building in Chicago. It's totally a revivalist structure because it has sort of lower level function. They tended to have, the lower 2 or 3 floors looked different because that identified a different function, because the lower levels of buildings like this were functioning differently. They were generally like a bank, or maybe today they tend to be restaurants and things like that. And then above that, you get the section where you have the offices, lots of individual offices. And then up at the top, these are stunning Gothic flying buttresses that are being used here. So it's a neo-Gothic building. And here you can see the details of the top right off of the Gothic cathedrals. So this is a perfect example of what was considered beauty at the time. And I don't deny it. I love this style. I love Gothic architecture. I think this is a beautiful building, but it certainly wasn't a modern building. It was this eclectic or mixed style of what people wanted in a building. And I'm pointing this out because we're going to look at what happens in American skyscraper design when certain individuals come over to this country and put the other half together. Americans have half of it. They have the engineering. Europeans were the ones creating this new modern design. So when they bring design over and merge it with American engineering, that's when we get the buildings that we see today and think of as skyscrapers. But this is still a beautiful building in Chicago. Interestingly, one of the designs for that project that was not accepted was this design by Walter Gropius. Remember, he was the director of the Bauhaus at this time. So he was even at that time. And now this is a very modern building. This to me this is what they should have picked. I mean, although I really love the Hood building, nonetheless, this was the most modern. But in America, they had no context for understanding a building like this. This would have looked just as odd as some of those other structures, but it's really beautiful, and it's Bauhaus design. And I'm not giving anything away by saying, it is when the Bauhaus teachers come to America, that they bring this with them. And it won't be long, in 30 years, this will be accepted as what is modern. But 22 is a little too early in America for a style like this on a building of this scale. Now, the other thing feeding into architectural design in the 20th century is the architectural design of Art Nouveau. Now, Art Nouveau was the dominant avant-garde style for architecture at the end of the 19th century, and it continued to be very influential up to World War I. And in fact, this is one of the most famous Art Nouveau design structures, the Samaritan department store in Paris from 1910, right at the height. Whole thing is Art Nouveau everywhere. It's beautiful. Has anybody been to this building? I have not been in this building. I've seen it, but I haven't been inside of it. I'd love to go over just to look at this building again because it's stunningly beautiful. Architecturally, however, structurally, it's no different than any other style. Art Nouveau is a decorative style. It's ornamentation that you put on the surface of a thing, but it has all of the characteristics of the organic nature of Art Nouveau, curvilinear forms. It's meant to look sort of handmade details and the like, very connected to life. Art Nouveau objects were very much about so the rejection of the machine aesthetic. They were rejecting the hard edges and angles of the machine aesthetic. So they went back to hand making and hand designing and creating forms that looked handmade. That rejection of technology or rejection of industry is not something we've seen in the 20th century. That was a 19th century phenomenon. By the 20th century, everything we've seen so far is people loving, not everything, but certainly after World War I, loving anything to do with machines. Machines were the future. We've seen it in all that constructivist art, all that Russian painting and sculpture that we saw. That was very industrial and very much what they were interested in. So Americans are not going to reject this machine aesthetic as we see at Art Nouveau. But I wanted to remind you of it because the first thing I want to look at or talk about briefly is Art Deco, and Deco very much is an acceptance and an embracing of that machine aesthetic. Art Deco is interesting. It started to be around a little bit right after World War I, but its height, the height of the movement is basically from about 25 to 35. That's when Art Deco is at its height. The name comes from a particular exhibition that pulled all of this together in 1925. It doesn't mean the movement began in 25. It was recognized and they showed it all in 25, and then it really becomes popular. So that's why its height begins in 25. The exhibition, the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Art. So this is where Art Deco, or Arts Décoratifs, as it was called in France. The purpose of the exposition itself was to, as you can see, elevate decorative art. It's still very much about applied ornament, detail on forms. The exhibition itself, over 15,000 artists and architects. I mean, that's a lot of people to communicate the style. It was also in this country very popular and was popularized by the Chicago World's Fair or Exposition in 33. And all of the forms you see on the posters are very much a reflection of Art Deco and what it looked like. The decorative element itself is rooted in a kind of machine interpretation of Art Nouveau. There's a real smooth movement from Art Nouveau into Art Deco. It's just that the lines, instead of being organic and curvilinear, tend to emphasize now more straight lines and edges, sharp lines and edges, less organic. I mean, a curve doesn't mean something's organic, not when it's a pure geometric form like a pure circle or whatever. It's not that sort of curling form of Art Nouveau. It also became, as Art Nouveau did actually, unintentionally, became associated with richness and opulence and expense. It was something that signified you were very wealthy if you had this. This was never a design style for the masses. Everything was very expensive, as was Art Nouveau. The difference is Art Nouveau saw itself as being for the masses. It just wasn't. Because their idea of going back to hand making everything was never going to be affordable to the masses. Handmade things are really expensive. That's why we had the Industrial Revolution in the first place, because it's cheaper. When you mass produce things on machines. So it was always a flawed idea. Art Deco is not trying to be handmade. It's easily mass produced. A lot of gold and a lot of sharp lines and angles. And in that way, it has a relationship to the sort of constructivist art we've been looking at in the last couple of classes, all those sort of hard-edged paintings and sharp geometry. That's part of it as well. Certainly, we have to look at the Chrysler Building because it is absolutely considered the best example in this country of Art Deco design. In terms of the engineering, it's just like every other skyscraper. It's just what you hang on the surface, and what they're hanging on the surface is these sort of rich materials. This was designed by William Van Allen, and has this crowning glass dome sections. It's absolutely stunning, both curvilinear and rectilinear forms. So straight edge and curving forms, but definitely not organic forms, emphasizing industrial as opposed to the handmade. Few buildings were really about one person in the way this building was. It was created for and paid for by Walter Chrysler in 1928. I just find some of these people like really interesting in the past. There's a lot of really interesting shows on like the Discovery Channel and like Men Who Made America, and they had one series on the automobiles that made America. If they ever run that again, I highly recommend you watch it. There's also one called The Food That Made America. Watch them because it's all about these people and this moment in time. And it's just fascinating. If you like history at all, you'll love those programs. Well, Walter Chrysler was in one of these, only they were looking at him as an automaker and his history and how he related to Ford and how all these guys knew each other and who worked for who. It's really fascinating. But Walter Chrysler's in this, but they didn't talk about the Chrysler Building. This is later, but it's actually not that much later. This was only 3 years after he started his automobile company that he was able to afford this building. This was not paid for by his auto company. He paid for this personally. He wanted to own this building because he wanted to leave it to his heirs. So this is his personal building, but it was also to be the headquarters of Chrysler. And I believe it still is. I think they still have their headquarters there, although it's not owned by Walter Chrysler anymore. After his death, his heirs sold it, and I can't remember who they sold it to. I think it's now owned by a sort of consortium of people, but he owned it solely at the time and wanted it to be unique. This is an homage to ego. I mean, when someone pays this kind of money to build something like this, and call it the Chrysler Building, there's a reason. So he won, he got it. This is still remembered and his name is still on it. It's absolutely an emphasis on this clean, strong lines, repetitive shapes. And there's certainly an influence of constructivist forms and ideas in this work of art. Later versions of Art Deco are sometimes referred to as streamline modernism, if you've ever heard that term, streamline modern. Does anybody watch the Poirot series, right, on PBS. But I love the building he lives in. They put a lot of Art Deco architecture in that series. You know, people, I swear there's one house I've seen several times in the different stories different people live in, where they'll show the same house from different angles, so you don't realize it's, but they tend to really focus on Art Deco architecture, and especially the building he lives in. So if you want to see more Art Deco architecture, watch Poirot, and you'll get to see a lot of it. Even details like this, I love these, their version of these sort of gargoyle-like figures, although very, modern materials, steel materials, exposed stainless steel, which you wouldn't have seen on earlier buildings, sort of abstract designs. Interior designs, here's more of the Art Deco designs. Notice there's a sort of symmetry there that was absent in Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau went out of its way to be asymmetrical, so it wouldn't look like it was machine made, but handmade. Here, rich, opulent forms. There's another influence on Art Deco, and that is the Vienna Secession. If you look back to the Art of Vienna, and I'm thinking of particularly Gustav Klimt, and I didn't bring any of his murals in, but he worked with gold and a lot of these curving forms like this and very abstract. There is a lot of that Vienna Secession style influence as well. So if you know Klimt, you might recognize some of the forms. There's a close-up on the sort of lower area, and I love this abstract geometry that you have here and this piece. And I'm trying to remember, I think some of these were used as the emblem on the early Chryslers, like where you have the radiator hood and they have these big, forms on there. I just, in my mind somewhere, that looks familiar, like that might have been a Chrysler. I could be wrong, but it just looks like it belongs on the hood of an automobile. Yeah, right. It's got a sense of speed and movement there as well. So ornament. Art Deco really disappears, well, in the same way that Art Nouveau disappeared after World War I, when it started. Art Deco in 39 kind of disappears when World War II begins. And in both cases, when the war ends, it's clearly old-fashioned looking. So it makes it up to World War II. But I want to take a look at three men now who really define the international style. And that is Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius. We've already looked at Walter Gropius. We're not going to look at it anymore. He was the designer of the Bauhaus building. He was the director of the Bauhaus. So we've really looked at his work. And then we just saw the plan he submitted for the Chicago Tribune Tower building. That was Gropius. So I don't feel we need to look at him again. We're going to look at Mies and Le Corbusier, who we've also seen before as a painter. So particularly, I want to look at Mies because he's one of the most influential people of the 20th century, and particularly in America as well. Le Corbusier, I don't think, did anything in this country. He's really French Swiss, and I think, I wouldn't swear to it, but I think all of his work is in Europe. They all knew each other. In fact, I found some interesting photographs of them sort of together. I didn't bring that in. International style is a term that was used broadly for slight variations of architectural style that were rooted in the same sort of constructivist sensibility that we saw all that painting. And I'll show you some of that painting again that we talked about before. Both Bauhaus design, de Stijl paintings by Mondrian that we looked at last time, and sort of the Russian painters as well. It's an emphasis, just like Bauhaus sensibility, on functionality. It's a rejection of applied ornament. We don't want, so of course it's going to totally reject Deco, which was all about applied ornament. So we don't have any of that stuff attached. It tend to emphasize flat roofs. Buildings were like boxes. It emphasized ribbon windows or long rows of windows. Like you see in the back of the room there, those would be considered ribbon windows, as we'll see. And I want to first take a look at Mies van der Rohe, or Mies. Most people just call him Mies as his last name. He was the last director of the Bauhaus. He started directing there in I think 30, and he was a director for 3 years. So he was the director when it closed. And we know that in 33, Hitler forced the Bauhaus to move back to Berlin. He wanted it where he could watch what they were doing, because he was already having real problems with modern style. And as I said, we will come back to all of that when we look at the 30s. When the Bauhaus closed down in 33, German artists knew by then the writing was on the wall. And by the mid-30s, German artists were leaving Germany. Mies and Mahalinaj, who we talked about when we looked at the Bauhaus, they came to Chicago. And it's one of the many reasons why Chicago is the home of modern architecture. They founded the new Bauhaus, which became the Illinois Institute of Design. There was already an ITT, Illinois Institute of Technology, that had been there since the 1890s, I think. And it was primarily like an engineering school. But when Mies and Mahali got there, they formed a second part of the IT, and it was called the Institute of Design. So the Institute of Design started out as the new Bauhaus and then sort of merged with ITT. Now it's known as the ITT Institute of Design, but it really is what was founded by Mahali and his important sense of design. Mahali and Mies, I should say, it's both of them. That's one of Mies's chairs, which I showed you briefly when we were looking at the Bauhaus, but I'm going to show you the building for which this chair was designed. Now, this was designed in 1929 by Mies van der Rohe, and this is the year before. He went right from this project to be the director of the Bauhaus. So this is literally right before then. It's called the German Pavilion, and it's located in Barcelona. It's called the German Pavilion, but it's in Barcelona, Spain. Let me explain that. In Barcelona, Spain, they held what was called an international exposition all through the 19th century. And I haven't had time to really talk about this, and we didn't even have time to cover it. But throughout the 19th century, there were these things we call world fairs, and they were generally expositions of some kind. They started by the mid-19th century, they were starting to become international. Earlier in the century, individual countries would have these fairs, like there would be an exposition in Paris, and all the French would get together and they would show all the new industrial products and all the new things of their country. But by mid-century, they started holding international world's fairs where all different countries would come together, and every country would have its pavilion or its area, and you would show what your country had done. These were contests. These were, my country's done more than your country. They were very competitive, and every country wanted to show the latest of their design. They would show art. They would show their new technology. And so there would be different pavilions. So this was built for the German pavilion at the fair in Barcelona, Spain. So that's why it's called what it is. And it's meant to be a demonstration of modern German design and architecture. Yeah.
That's what the International Exhibit of Modern Decorative Art was in 1925, wasn't it?
Yes.
The World's Fair.
Yeah, I'd have to double check on that.
I remember that because when we first moved here, the art museum had a World's Fair exhibition, and they made a point of mentioning that Coolidge was the president at the time, and he didn't send anything to France because there wasn't anything new in America.
Well, he's probably right in 1925.
Oh, okay. We were not represented.
Well, yeah. Yeah, Americans always felt inferior to European. There's a lot of our history can be better understood when you understand that there was a need to sort of compete with Europe. Now, every time I see, particularly this view of the building, with that flag in front of it, that flag makes a difference to me. It looks like every elementary school I've ever seen from the 1950s. Wouldn't you have just sworn this was built in the 1950s and it's an elementary school? That's just what it looks like. And I swear that I went to one that looked exactly like
Sort of like our church.
a bit. It's sort of 50-ish. This is not meant to be a sort of that's what he called it, or an abstract shelter. These things sort of relate to sort of painting and sculpture styles. For that sculpture, that the sculpture was about flat plains.
Peggy, you're breaking up online. We aren't hearing you. You're pausing.
Deny the mass of the walls. They'll create a design where the walls seem very, very thin, as if they're like just little cardboard shapes. And you can create that illusion sometimes through windows and window placement. And we'll see that in other buildings. But this is very much like, they always look like they're made out of playing cards. If you've ever had like playing cards, you stack them up to build square forms, that's exactly what they're meant to look like, just these flat planes. And there's a lot of open space. Here's the plan. There is an outdoor water section, walls that extend out. So it's playing with this indoor-outdoor space. It's not really like a traditional home where you walk in and it's all indoors, and then maybe you've got a yard, but this is both. You're moving indoor and outdoor. I couldn't resist bringing this color study by Van Doesburg back in because when we will look at the floor plan for the Barcelona Van Doesburg did, he called it color study for what we're seeing is all these.
Peggy,
Yes.
you're breaking up online quite a bit. I don't know that you can do anything about it, but be aware.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what. Is it better now? I'm not sure what I can
It
do.
comes and goes.
Okay.
It freezes and then you come back and then you're frozen again for a period of time, and then it comes back and then you're frozen again for a period of time.
Was there something on our screen?
The internet is unstable.
Internet is unstable. That's the signal that shows up on our screen. I remember this happening in the past. Yeah, I think our internet is a bit unstable today. So if it happens, please jump in and ask, if you missed something, I'll be happy to repeat it. That's about all I can think of to do at this point. So anyway, at this moment, what we have is a moment in time where painting, sculpture, and architecture have never been closer. They're really merging as an idea in people's minds and feeding off onto one another. Inside, it's designed to have movable walls, flexible wall interiors. This is a principle that we see in others. We'll see this in Corbusier's architecture as well. A lot of exposed spaces. The idea that it's a very open floor plan, very different from the enclosed buildings of sort of 19th century domestic architecture, open, walls that move and slide. And even when walls don't physically move and slide, they're designed, the building is designed so that if it's built for one person, they can choose to say, build their walls here, another person can build their walls there. So there's a flexibility of wall placement that you wouldn't necessarily see in all buildings. This is the building he designed this chair for, which is why it's known as the Barcelona chair. And the Barcelona chairs, like Bauhaus chairs, were very popular in the 1970s again. So these were Mises' designs. I think the Barcelona chair is one of the most beautiful chairs I've ever seen. I've known a lot of people that have had them. You can buy much of this stuff today, and it's not that expensive.
I always wanted one of those chairs.
Me
but I
too.
never got a place to put it because
They're large.
they're
Mhm.
big.
They can be large, and you can get benches that are more like couches too, but they are just stunningly beautiful. One of the influences on his design is traditional Japanese interior, and we're going to see that those influences on Frank Lloyd Wright as well, in its simplicity, in its flexibility of moving spaces. Often it's emphasis on sort of floor and ceiling. So that's very influential on all these designs. We know that Japanese styles have been influencing Europeans since the mid-19th century in terms of the prints that were influencing artists, and now the architecture is influencing artists. By 1951 is when Mies finally is able to build one of his new skyscraper forms. The Lakeshore Drive apartments were built 51, and they are an example of this merging finally of American engineering and what I think of by this time as a Bauhaus style or exterior. You know, one of the things we saw at the Bauhaus was Gropius's glass curtain wall on the workshop there, because the wall was not load bearing. Well, it's quite logical if skyscrapers have walls that are not load bearing, there's no reason they can't be glass. Nobody just thought to do it before. Those 19th century skyscrapers could very well have had glass walls. It just wasn't something that was on their mind to do. They were looking more toward traditional architecture, but now glass walls are there. And these are basically two buildings that are placed perpendicular to one another. There's the glass curtain wall that Gropius had designed for the Bauhaus that we see now here. The other addition that Mies has, and we see this on many of his buildings, we'll see it on Corbusier's buildings too, and that is the use of pilotis. Pilotis are these exposed sort of intermediary space. It's something that's so ordinary to us now. You go into a big city and walk downtown, every building has these. As you walk down the street, you know, the building doesn't come out to the sidewalk. There's usually a covered area that you walk through. It's intermediary, it's indoor, outdoor. That's part of it, but also the exposure of the structure is part of it as well. That mattered, that these beams were exposed, that you could look at the building and literally see its skeleton. You could see how it was constructed. And by leaving these pilotis exposed, we see that. It sets up this wonderful sort of way of looking at the building, because as you look up the building, you could see sort of the exposed girders as well. What you also see is how the windows are pressed out flush, almost, not completely, but almost flush with the exterior of the building, which means you don't see a wide setback for the windows, which makes you see the surface psychologically as a flat plane, as opposed to like a deep, thick wall. And that was part of it as well, to make you see it as a flat plane. Inside, interior designs, more of the Barcelona chairs and other Bauhaus chairs there on the left. It looks very much like a lot of buildings in New York that I've been in for friends that live there, where you have one wall that's solid glass and then that's your only windows because the rest of it is just wall space. That's a Chicago style. The other thing I wanted to say about Chicago and why it's home of modern architecture has to do with how they skyscrapers. And if you look at the New York skyline, you can see why, because it goes low and then high here and then low again. There's only one area on you can't, which is why they don't, there's one section of New York where all the skyscrapers are. Chicago has this bedrock, and that made it engineering, in terms of engineering, possible to build there. Now, before we finish off Mies and look at like one of his most famous skyscrapers, I do want to important building. Philip Johnson, American architect, was the very famous glass house in New Canaan, Connecticut, from 1949. This is certain. This of land in Connecticut. It has 10 other buildings also by him from different periods. This is his land and this was his home. So this wasn't like a commission or anything. The glass house, it is a place to live as much as a sort of stage. And people always have opinions about the glass house. It is a completely open area and is also very influenced by Japanese architecture. Again, in its openness, Japanese buildings like this is actually the Katsura villa in Edo, but these sliding exterior doors, depending on the time of year and what you saw in your garden, these walls would be opened up. And so that idea of being inside and looking out on this beautiful scene is certainly something that influences Johnson. But here's some more variations of the Mies furniture. The whole thing is open all the way around, except for one section in the center that's a brick spiral area where there's a fireplace and then the surrounding the bathroom. You could see it in the middle, but the rest is completely open. How do you feel about a building like this?
It has to be cold in the winter.
Well, it's Connecticut. Yeah, you'd think so. There's a big fireplace. Could you live in a structure like that?
No.
I'd love it. I'd love it.
It's in the middle. There's a brick. I can't see it very well, but right in the middle, there's a sort of a rounded brick structure. The bathroom is in there. The fireplace is located. You can see it curving around right there. You would love to, Carol?
I said I would love it.
You would love it.
Sue.
Wow.
Who is that?
I'm not sure. Who am I? Sue. It's Sue.
But there are no close neighbors.
No, there's nobody. I still couldn't do it. Even with no close neighbors, I couldn't do it. I would be so uncomfortable. It makes me a little uncomfortable just looking at the building.
And there's not that in the daytime, you can see out, but at nighttime.
To be that exposed, you have to be really secure to not feel terribly exposed. But
And
clearly,
we have no curtains on our house anywhere.
I don't know how you can do it. I had a friend was like that too, and she had no curtains and she had no problems whatsoever doing that. And I was just so uncomfortable at night being in that home.
It has tile floor too.
Brick, I think.
The one on the,
Yeah.
They're-
down below. Isn't that a tile?
It's rug. It's a rug on brick. That white is a rug.
Brick, right?
That's brick. Yeah. Yeah, it would be.
Sometimes they had a heating element beneath it, didn't they?
I don't know, but that makes sense to me. I would certainly hope so. Yeah, I would certainly hope so. So this is where Johnson is. Philip Johnson's head is doing things like this. So when he begins to work with Mies van der Rohe on another very important commission, this one in New York, what we get is a building that is widely considered to be one of the most beautiful skyscrapers ever built. To me, I have no doubt this is the most beautiful skyscraper ever built. It's stunning. It's clad in bronze. This is not cheap. Now, the problem with skyscrapers and the why so many people don't like skyscrapers architecturally is that the vast majority of them are built for one reason, because it's a cheap way to build. And they're going to keep it as cheap as possible. They tend to not be ventilated very well. Today, none of them have windows that open. Some of those early ones used to have windows that opened at least. You could have some ventilation. And they generally are created without any sense of design whatsoever. Every architectural firm has a bunch of sort of standardized skyscrapers. There's 2 or 3 skyscrapers designs that you could go to any city in this country and find that building that an architectural firm has put up in like every city. And so every firm has their standard buildings like that. This is long before that. In fact, I love this photo on the right. You could see, what was around it when it was actually built. And this is 56, begun in 1956, that they're by far, and it's like 83 stories. No, it's not. It's like 33 stories. It's 38. I forget how many, something like that. It's in the 30s. So it's dwarfed by many buildings now.
Which building? Okay, the browner one is the one.
Yes, this is the Seagram building.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's anything but cheap. This is bronze, covered in bronze. That's way too expensive to do if you're trying to just make money from it. But it's a perfect example of the international style architecture. It's the engineering with this simplicity. That doesn't mean it's plain. One of the things you may notice here as well is I love this building over here that's next to it, which was a huge building when it was built. That people came out to see this building for its size, but notice how it's built right out to the street. It was the Seagram building itself that led to the 1961 zoning resolution in New York, and most cities have them now, that require a building over a certain height to be set back. You can't take up all the property. Some cities it's worded that it can't take up more than a certain percentage of the lot, like 35%, meaning the rest has to be just open space around it. In other cases, it's if it's over this many stories, it must have this much space around it. Because they recognized pretty quickly, if they didn't do that, downtown cities were just going to be these narrow little dark tunnels with these wind vortexes through them. It could have been really, really bad. But now we're all used to that in cities. The buildings always have these open plazas in front of them. I mean, that's the reason why it's absolutely required. In terms of here is a wonderful picture of it going up. You can see the framework. Can you imagine? Seeing it like this makes it feel much taller to me for some reason. I can just imagine these guys walking up here on the edge of it. When we look at this surface, here's what we've got. Now we've got these beautiful vertical bronze sort of mullions that are bronze, and then these horizontal elements are made from what is called Muntz metal, MUNTZ. Muntz metal is an alloy. It's closer to a kind of brass than it is bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, mostly copper, with maybe 12 to 15% tin. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, with a small amount of zinc. That brass is different, and brass gives you that shiny, almost golden look, where bronze tends to be darker, and it's going to weather differently depending on the percent of copper. And Muntz metal, which is created by a guy named Muntz, is like a brass, but it's got a different percentage in it. The value is it's harder than bronze. Bronze is softer than brass or Muntz metal. So it gives a slightly different color, a different reflective quality. It's stronger. Now, there is quite an interesting design element to the surface of this building, but it's not considered ornament because it's structural. It's not added to the surface, it is the surface. So as long as you're not adding elements, they don't consider it ornament. Doesn't mean it has to be plain just because it doesn't have ornament. It can be quite beautiful. And the glass itself is really quite beautiful as well. Here's the plaza with its two fountains and that image again on the side. This also went through a lot of different hands. It was originally meant to be, I think it was owned by Seagram as their international headquarters. And then in '89, it became a city landmark, New York Landmarks Preservation Commission. And I think it's also, it's on the National Registry. And I think it's also owned by a consortium today. The ground levels are restaurants that have changed restaurants 2 or 3 times. But it is sort of the hallmark for skyscrapers. Everything else is going downhill from this one, as far as I'm concerned. None of them have ever cared that much about them. Here's the pilotis again on the ground level. I did want to throw in one building by but it's certainly not a Bauhaus design. It's a distilled. Gosh, we really are unstable today. This is the most famous Rietveld house, the Schroeder house in Utrecht. And it's also an excellent example of distill architecture, which is a type of international style. These are so similar. If I did a little model of this, I could probably just call it a sculpture and exhibit it. I mean, the only difference between this and sculpture is the size. I can go inside of it, but the sculpture's too small. But other than that, they're basically the same. Color is an important emphasis here. And you can also see this emphasis on planes, these sort of shallow planes. Again, this is like the playing card house. And he's doing everything he can to emphasize the flatness of the planes as opposed to the mass of the walls. The bits of color, bits of vertical colors, primary colors, are what we would expect in anything in the distill style. There's the Van Doesburg again, a Modrian painting. It's as if you just took a Modrian painting and cut it up and then built a house out of it. I mean, it's the same type of form. Although, we know that Modrian was steeped in a kind of philosophy where Rietveld is not. He's not trying to depict this sort of Taoist sensibility that we saw inside. However, it does reflect the same style. And this is the house that this chair was created for. This house is perfectly reflected in that chair in terms of its planes and its minimal primary colors. Now it's time to talk about our friend Le Corbusier. Again, because we've already talked about it. His real name is Jeanneret, and we looked at him when we were looking at Cubism, and we were looking at movements influenced by Cubism, and Purism was one of those movements. We looked at 2 artists, Amédée Ozenfant and Charles-Edouard Jeanneret, and that is one of his paintings that we looked at more than once. However, he is by far better known as an architect. In fact, most people don't even know he was a painter. And it's as Le Corbusier, a nickname that he is known. I love that photo. He always, even when he was a very young man, he wore these black round glasses all his life. You could always recognize him in any photo of any kind. He was very much, as a young man in the 20s, caught up in the sort of utopian ideals of building a new world. And I've talked about the utopianism of the 20s, but now we're going to look at some of it because so many of them were caught up in that. The idea of how we should live our lives, how we should build cities, how do we build this new modern world that's beginning? And he's very much caught up in that. As he said, one of the quotes is, he said, "A house is a machine for living in," and he very much believed that. Now, I have this car here, partially because I love it. I think it's beautiful. The 27 Citroen. He used the automobile industry as a model for how things should be done, for how things should be made. When he said, you know, a home is a machine to be living in, he meant that it should run like a machine. It should have the efficiency of a machine. The automobile industry was the model of efficiency and design, mass production. This is how we should build houses. They should be systematic. They should be standardized. We should build them quickly. They should be available for everyone. That's his design. And not just him, a lot of architects were doing experimental architectural designs to find this perfect building, because there was a real need for housing across Europe, everywhere after the war. The population boomed in the 20s, and there was a real need for housing. And he's involved in that. So let's take a look at some of what he wanted to do. We're going to look at some of his city plans for futuristic cities, which are, again, very much of the moment. This is actually a drawing he did of a city of the future plan with a multi-tiered transit system. One of the things he designed in his future cities are these multi-levels, subways below ground, a ground level, and then multiple terrace levels above that. I've always been really interested in early filmmaking, and particularly films of the 20s and the 30s. And there are a lot of films from that period that capture this fascination with utopianism. If you're familiar with like the German film Metropolis, silent film, if you've never seen Metropolis, everyone should see Metropolis. It's a silent film. It's German, but there are subtitles. And they just, maybe 20 years ago, they redid the film and put it out again. It was making the circuit. They restored it. So it's out there. You can find Metropolis. I think it's 29. You will absolutely see these designs in these cities. In addition to Metropolis, I already mentioned The Shape of Things to Come, just from the 30s, which Mahaly designed. But they all take place in these futuristic cities, and they're all, this is what they are. So it's a beautiful design. But the plan I want to look at is his first really systematic design, a ville contemporaine, or modern city is basically what it means. It was a proposed city for 3 million. These utopian designs that were coming out at the time were idealistic to the extreme. I mean, as far as I know, there's only been once where, probably in the history of the world, where someone has taken completely empty land and just went in and built a city there. That's really not where cities come from. Cities just, you can add on, you can reconstruct, but to just go out and from ground, build a new city is not something that happens ever. I think the only thing I can think of is Brasilia in Brazil, which was a city they just carved out part of the jungle, and from scratch they built a whole city all at once. So that's a rare thing. It's never ever been done since then. But that's what he wanted to do. It was a proposed city for 3 million people. It was first presented, his plans were first presented at the Autumn Salon in Paris in 1922. The plan is intensely rational, but very uncompromising. It's very controlled. It's not only controlling what buildings look like, but how you live your life as well. It made certain assumptions that you had this perfectly open land, that it was perfectly flat. And he designed 24 identical skyscrapers on this grid plan. It's a way of increasing density, he said, without congestion. It was based on the assumption of subways running all through it. Major transportation was underground throughout the city. The central area, these 24, this is the commercial zone. So these would be offices, buildings like that. Outside that is residential. So these are all residences. And you can see there's actually a lot of open space. He said, 95% of the space is open and green land. So there's open areas and green land between and among all of these. So this is the residential area. And then out here is the, basically this is the industrial. So this is where the factories and these would be factories and other industrial parts. So it's very logically structured. It assumes everyone's going to live the same way and work in the same way and move around in the same way. So as a design, it's a, an interesting idea, but of course it's never going to happen. His second plan was meant to be more practical. The Plan Voisin, or the neighborhood, this was an actual plan for a part of Paris. It was basically for the North Bank, which at that time was, I guess you would call it a slum area. There was no sanitation, the buildings were in bad shape, and it was a fairly large area. It was about 2 square miles that he proposed. They simply tear down. What about all the people who actually live there? Well, he said they should be moved to new garden cities outside of Paris, that we should build these nice little villages that have gardens and move everyone out there. Which, what about the people that already live out there and that own that? I mean, it's an idealism that wasn't particularly thought through very well. Here's how we should do it. He condemned what he called diversity of architecture. What he hated about most cities was that it was so different. All these buildings are different from one another. They should all be the same. They should all look alike. Now, a lot of these ideas, and not just his, but a lot of these plans for these utopian communities where everything is alike, this is also rooted in the politics of the time. You had had the Russian Revolution in 1917. There were a lot of communists in Western Europe. Most intellectuals were believers in the socialist ideal, and this sort of equality, it was seen as equality, the essence of equality. You all live in the same house. You all have access to the same things. That's equality. That's the opposite of capitalism, which was seen as greedy and corrupt, which, it was and largely is. But it was also based on an idealistic view of the communist revolution and what socialism really was. It's about socialism as a theory, not socialism as an actual practice. But you have to see it within that context as well. There's a sense of equality in all of these things. He didn't like buildings that were discordant with one another. So this was his plan for Paris, and it's somewhat similar in that you have these regions, these areas. Needless to say, that didn't come about either. And again, it was to have multi-level transportation to make all of this possible. I like the design of these skyscrapers rather than just a simple rectangle. It's a complex form that actually gives you the maximum wall space. So you have the maximum window space. By designing it like this, you can have windows on all of these surfaces. It's the maximum amount of exposed surface. So you can have windows everywhere. And then his last design of this type was for the Radiant City, and he also had designs for what he called the Radiant Farms, the Radiant Villages. He was ready to go out and landscape the countryside. He was ready to really construct the life you live in. It was like constructing your life, not just the building, but all of these designs, would determine how you lived your life, not just where you lived your life. So the Radiant City design was meant to be much more of a universal plan. He also, by this time, the 30s, was talking about how really buildings or dwellings were a public service, that your buildings shouldn't be bought by you. This is a public service, Again, this is very much a socialist ideal that everything's owned by the state and the state should build these and they give them to you. This is a public service. And in his book, he really talks about that. We'll talk about that in a minute. He had things planned that designed, your whole day, 24 hours of your day. He believed that leisure was the menace of modern times. Now, this idea that you need to design every minute of every day, you construct how someone lives. That's a 19th century idea because they were afraid of leisure time in the 19th century when industrialism began to change a bit so that people had maybe a weekend off and weren't working every day. That's when people started getting really afraid. They were afraid of the working class. They were afraid of giving leisure time to the working class. So let's find ways to keep them busy. And we talked about that when we talked about British art and how they created the settlement houses and things that would keep people, teaching people craft, to keep your hand, idle hands and all of that. So there's a bit of that still there. Like he was afraid of leisure. So let's design things for people to do all the time. I keep thinking of, 1984 and Big Brother and all of that, but they didn't see it that way at that time. In fact, that's what Orwell was responding to when he wrote 1984 in 1949. He wrote it in 49, and he's responding to a lot of this utopianism and socialism of the 20s and 30s. And so 1984 is a response to these same ideas, in a response in a negative way. But some things do happen. Some things did come to fruition, not the big plans. We have to do it small. The Citroën project was sponsored by the Deutsche Werkbund. The Deutsche Werkbund was a German organization, a group of architects and designers and artists in Germany. And they had, in 1927, they had a sort of showcase. It was called International for International Style Architecture. And they had this huge estate. It was called the Wiesenhof Estate in Stuttgart, Germany, this huge area. And they invited 17 different architects, and 60 buildings were put up on this one estate, all of them showing this new style, but now in domestic architecture, as opposed to the skyscraper or the tall building. And Le Corbusier has 2 buildings there. Mies van Roo actually has 4 buildings that he designed there. They're all in the architectural style. And this is one of them. One of the structures. He called it the Citroën project. He had actually several house designs, all as part of this Citroën project. And he named it after the automobile, the Citroën. And he called it that because the houses were meant to be as efficient as an automobile company, as efficient as Citroën. So these are my automobile houses. My houses built mass-produced houses. And they are an interesting design. They're meant to be fairly inexpensive. These are meant to be affordable to people. And they have certain characteristics that will allow you to sort of personalize them. And this is one of them that was built in Stuttgart. I love the little model of it. It's, first of all, it has what he calls his 5 points of architecture. These are 5 things that should be in every building. The pilotis, which lift it up off the ground and open it up. The roof terrace, because these were designed to be sort of in cities where you may not have yards. So let's have a terrace on the roof so everyone gets an open space. A free plan. A free plan means that it's built in such a way, and it's a small structure. So these can be load-bearing walls, but there are still steel supports within the building. A free plan means that if you're having one of these built, you can have the walls put wherever you want them to. It's free for you to choose where you want these interior walls. You can have the same building, but each person gets to decide where they want the walls. So, and in the same way, the free facade, meaning you decide where your walls are. You can also decide where you want your windows, because we can put them anywhere because of the structure of it. So free plan, a free facade, and then horizontal ribbon windows. So the windows are going to be in bands like this. It's also seen as sort of a modern design. And this building would have all of those designs. It's the ultimate box, and it's the ultimate modern design. Again, when you think of modern architecture, it's a plain box, no ornament, nothing on the outside. You can see the windows are pushed out so that you don't see a deep sill on the outside, so that it seems very flat, and lots of glass as a structure. So these were meant to be widely built. They never really were. Again, it didn't really catch on. This whole Wiesenhof estate is a World Heritage Site now. So all these buildings are still there.
Peggy,
Yes.
are those built like skyscrapers? I mean, are the walls, curtain walls? I notice all that glass. I'm wondering if that's structural.
Yeah, you can see the pilotis and the steel going through, structuring them.
Oh, so they, okay.
Yes, so that's why you can put the windows anywhere.
Gotcha.
Right, so you can put the window, and the front is all, but you can see the exposed supports inside through the windows. Yeah. His most famous domestic architecture is the very, very famous Villa Savoie in Poissy in France. And this is anything but an egalitarian building. This is commissioned and built for someone with a good deal of money. And we'll see how that is very evident when we look inside of it. It's a one-of-a-kind commission. It's often heralded as a classic example of international style. You can see the pilotis, you can see the band of windows, and again, because it's one of a kind, you don't really have to worry about free wall plans or floor plans or whatever, because it's one of a kind. This was designed and that's it. I love the roof, and it has a roof terrace, as we'll see, that has these curving forms that basically hide utilitarian elements, so that you don't have to see them on the roof. But it's modeled after something. It's modeled after what was seen at the time as the most advanced industrial products that they had, and that was the great ocean liners. These were the great models of the future and signs of man's ability. And he's using that to model this building, not the least of which is these curved forms that mimic the funnels of the structure. They have the sort of ribbon windows, the curved area down here. This is what it's meant to evoke. It's sleek, it's streamlined, it has those qualities and characteristics of modern industry. Here's a cutaway view, and you can see the roof terrace. There are other things that reference the ship inside. There aren't any traditional stairs. It's all ramps or spiral stairs like you would find in a ship, as we'll see. Here's the ground level. Now, the ground level is a garage, 3-car garage. Not that many people have 3-car garages today, but I guarantee you at the time, this was a very wealthy person if they need a 3-car garage. Not to mention the fact that also behind the cars is the maids' rooms. So this is where the maids live. So obviously this is very different from the Citroen house, which was meant to be sort of for everyone. So functional ground level. The next level up, the first, what in Europe would be called the first floor, is where the family lived, and we have some interior spaces. I can see the sort of relationship to something like Art Deco is still visible here in terms of some of its curving forms and swooping forms. It reminds me of some Art Deco design, although without the ornamentation. The principal rooms themselves, now here's the Le Corbusier chair, and I showed you one of those when we looked at the Bauhaus chairs and furniture. I'm not sure if he designed it for this house or not. I don't want to swear to that. He may have, I don't know. But this is the Corbusier design chair, which you can still get. The ribbon windows, I'm not sure who those people are, what they're doing there. It also has indoor, outdoor living on this space. It completely opens up to the outdoor area. In fact, from the outside, it's hard to tell. You have glass indoor windows and then suddenly no glass and outdoor space. So it's hard to tell what is indoor space and outdoor space, because the outdoor space will have windows as well. You can see in the back there windows as well. And then the ramp going up to the top, sort of with a kind of private garden area. And then over to the other side, there's sort of other utility things that have been hidden. Now,
the climate have been there. The climate.
This is France, so it's going to have winters. I'm not sure where Poissy is, truthfully. Unless it's on the Mediterranean, they're going to have winters there, and it's going to be cold. So, yeah, I have to look up where that is. I'm not really sure. This had fallen into terrible condition by the 1950s. It had been abandoned. It was an empty building. It was in really bad shape. Someone at some point had painted it pink. So the whole thing was pink.
Right outside of Paris.
It's right outside of Paris. So it's going to be cold. And the local farmer was actually using it to store bales of hay. So it just was an abandoned building. And I don't remember when someone finally said, wait a minute, this is an important building. And I don't remember the details. It doesn't really matter that much, but it was then, repaired, and now it's for tours, and, it's in good shape now, but it was in pretty bad shape. Okay. Let's move to America and talk about our Unitarian architect. Frank Lloyd Wright is the most influential architect of the 20th century. And as far as I'm concerned, will probably always be, for a long time, the most influential architect we've ever had in the world. Because I can't think of any architect in history that has had more influence than Wright during his lifetime. And his work is the first to really attempt to make an American architectural style. And he really clearly did that. I know many of you already know a lot about Frank Lloyd Wright. He was raised in a very traditional Unitarian family. They studied the Transcendentalists. He was homeschooled by his mother using Froebel blocks, very intentionally using the Froebel system to teach him these ideas of connection, interconnection, that were such an important part of their own religious and spiritual beliefs. So Unitarianism had a huge effect on American architecture. It's one of the most influential religions in this country, if only because of Frank Lloyd Wright. In terms of the way he connected his buildings to the land and the prairie, and reached out and saw everything that way. But I'll come back to that in just a minute. Other events influential on him are, as we'll see, his visits to Japan, making that influential. But before, he primarily focused on domestic architecture, but not exclusively. We will look at one of his business structures. But before we look at what he was doing, I want you to see what was happening in America at the time in the late 19th century. This, if you were rich and had an architect design you a home, this is what you had. The wedding cake house, which is bizarre. It's basically a plain box with this stuff stuck over it. You can see why it's called the wedding cake house. I mean, it's pretty obvious. Or something like the Morris house, which is, this neo-Renaissance. It could be a Renaissance palazzo. That's what it's designed to be. And it's covered with ornamental pediments and columns and details. The most bizarre, the very famous Palmer Mansion, which no longer exists in Chicago. This is the Palmer family that owned the Palmer House Hotel. A really, really bizarre neo-Romanesque, neo-medieval castle. It's a castle, right? It's just a castle that spoke to obviously wealth and power. It wasn't, but they're not all bizarre. Some of them are really beautiful buildings. This building designed by Hunt, a lot of them are in Newport. Some don't stand, some still do. The Breakers is one of the most famous of the 19th century, again, neo-Renaissance buildings. It's a beautiful structure, but this is what people wanted, that sort of eclectic style in America. This is 95. This is what Frank Lloyd Wright designs 2 years before that in 1893. Now, the fact that we could probably drive by this house today and not look twice at it. Actually, I would love to live in this house. I love this design. I think it's beautiful. It's early Wright. He worked in the office of Louis Sullivan in Chicago, Adler and Sullivan, for a number of years. He got fired in 92. This is one of his first houses on his own. He got fired for moonlighting. He was already doing his own work, and Sullivan found out. So he opened his own studio in 92 in Oak Park. And this is one of the first structures he did. It's not a fully developed prairie style as yet, but clearly it's very different from anything anyone else was building. Its horizontal emphasis is part of what will be seen as prairie style. That horizontality, that low angle of the roof line is an important part of what will be the style. What is not prairie style is the emphasis on the front door and the symmetry of the building. He'll do away with that. This is still very symmetrical. What I think is beautiful. I like symmetry. I have no problem with symmetry. And there's also some wonderful sort of decoration. That comes from his time with Louis Sullivan. They still used a lot of ornate and decorative ornamentation, and he will still do that. This was done, one of the big influences on this was the Chicago Exposition. The World's Columbian Exposition in 1893 was very, very important, very famous exposition. And one of the things they had there, they often had, exhibits from different countries, and Japan sent over complete reconstruction of a Buddhist monastery, the buildings from a monastery. And one of the buildings, the main building, was called the Ho'oden. He saw that and was very influential by the design, the Japanese design, the low profile, the angle of the roof line. All of this is going to feed into his architectural style. Here you can see the details of this decorative element around the building in this beautiful marble. By 1900, this is another house. He's designing lots and lots of houses. I'm just randomly picking a few along the way. This is in Kankakee, Illinois, and it's still very much still there, the Bradley House. It is usually seen and heralded as the first prairie style house. However, there's another house built the same year that claims it was the first prairie style. I mean, who cares? But it does have, they both have all of the characteristics of the prairie style. Now, in terms of the materials that are used, the colors, the way it reaches out into nature. It was a critic writing about his work that named it the prairie style. It wasn't meant to be derogatory at all, but it called it that because of the way it related to sort of the prairie. He's building these things in the Midwest. And they reach out horizontally and reflect the land. And that's very intentional on his part. They tend to use local materials. He often has bricks made locally, so they'll have the colors of the natural soil and the stonework, and so that it blends in with the natural environment. They will typically have indoor-outdoor spaces and cantilevered roofs that reach out. We'll see that more. Cantilevering is when something reaches out, but it has no support below it. It's sort of open. And you can do that once you have steel, and you can put like a steel framework in there. You don't need support below it. So let's take some more details of the Bradley house. You can also see here his use of art glass. He will continue to use art glass. We don't call it, sometimes you'll see it called stained glass. It's usually referred to as art glass because of sort of how it's made. It's a different methodology, but it's a similar idea. And it will be full of designs that are the decorative element in his works. The Willits house, this is the other one that claims to be the first prairie style. It is a little bit late, finished it a little later. I think it's a little more advanced design. You can also see, this is very early. This is long before the international style in Europe. There's no such thing as international. This is 1902. Europe was still enamored with Art Nouveau. I mean, this is long before World War I. So the sort of simplicity, the plain surfaces and these expanses, this is coming from it's not coming from Europe. The plan as they reach out in different directions. Showing you the plan here, because I mean, it's such a change from the traditional hall plans where you have a self-enclosed sort of rectangular space, a long hall with rooms off of it. He wanted spaces to open out between rooms. It's almost like turning a traditional house inside out and sort of reversing everything about it. This way of thinking about space, he says, came to him from his Froebel projects. And these are some of Wright's designs on the left, and on the right are some of the designs done in the projects with Froebel blocks. He is the first one to acknowledge this. He openly, repeatedly says how influenced he was by being educated by his mother in this Froebel system, and how it helped him see how architecture relates to other aspects of life. It also, I think, affected his obsession with designing everything inside the building as well as the building itself. The furniture, rugs, carpet, everything in it is part of the design. He said it was ridiculous to think of it as a separate thing. It's all part of one thing. So he's also planning a way for people to live, in the same way that the utopians later will do. The Roby house, certainly one of the best known. In many ways, the ultimate example of the prairie style house.
Do you know where that's located?
Yeah, it's right next to the University of Chicago campus. In fact, it is currently owned by the University of Chicago. It has an interesting history. It's Highland Park area, which is where University of Chicago is. It was commissioned by the Roby family. Roby was only 28 years old when he commissioned this for his family. He was assistant manager in this business that his father owned. His wife was a recent graduate of the University of Chicago, and she wanted it built right by the campus so that they would have access to all of the sort of social activities and the like from the university. So that's where it was built. All in, the cost of building this house was $58,000, and that includes $58,500, and that includes $13,500 for the land, and then all of the construction and design was $35,000, which, if you can imagine, in 1909, that was a hell of a lot of money. And someone's calculated it with inflation alone, it's worth 1.5 million. And that's just inflation of the dollars of what it was worth. Obviously, it's priceless. Roby was forced to sell the house, however, only a little over a year after he bought it. His father died, and it turned out he was bankrupt. It was an economic thing, and he had to sell it off. And he sold it after it went through several different hands, but eventually the Chicago Theological Seminary, and in 1940, happening. So Mies got involved immediately, and there were protests that became a kind of a national idea. The students got involved, and this was in 41. And so the seminary postponed the demolition because World War I started. It was mainly the war started, World War II started, and they just sort of set aside the idea to demolish it. However, 16 years later, in 1957, the seminary announced plans once again to demolish this building so they could put up a dormitory for their students. They needed a dormitory. And this time it got international attention because by 57, Wright he's most definitely still alive and still working and is an international figure. So this time, Wright himself comes. He was 90 years old. So he came back himself, returned to the Roby house, but so did, the media. Students were protesting, and 3 fraternity houses on the University of Chicago campus offered to make their fraternity houses available to the seminary to use for a dormitory. They literally moved out of their fraternity houses and donated space. So the seminary agreed not to demolish it, and used those fraternity houses. And then Wright went to a friend of his who ran a real estate development company and suggested he buy the house from the seminary, and he did. His development company, Webb and Knapp, bought the house, and in 63, then they donated it to the University of Chicago. And so that's who owns it now. It's literally, across the street is one of the buildings of the University of Chicago. So it's practically in the middle of their campus or on the edge of their campus. So they actually used it for a little while, a few years. They used it for offices. It was the alumni office for a while. And then under the support of the Chicago mayor, this is Richard Daley, the senior, he had the Chicago Landmarks Commission identify the house as a Chicago landmark. So at that point, it was turned into a museum, which it is today. Anybody been there on one of the tours? I've been there. It's
on the outside of it.
you can you have to get tickets ahead of time. You can't just walk up and get tickets. You can get them online. But I was really glad when I finally got to see it because it's not what it looks like. I think the thing that stunned me most is how big it is. It's much bigger than it looks in this picture, much bigger. When you're standing there, you're barely as tall as you're about this tall.
Oh,
So it's actually, the scale to me is a little deceptive. It's physically a lot bigger than I thought it was. So let's look at some parts of it. Let's take a little tour of some of the elements. First of all, as a prairie style house, it is of course made from local brick. He had special bricks made, and I'll show you those bricks in a minute. They're an unusual shape. They're particularly long, so they emphasize the horizontality of the building itself. It's the color. It reaches out into the prairie in so many ways. The windows, important. The lower level, I'm not going to go into all the detail. One of the first things you see is the asymmetry. One of the second things is, where the hell's the door? How do you get into this building? I'm looking straight on the front of it and I don't see any entranceway. And that's because it's not in the front at all, it's in the back. You have to go all the way around to the back and there's a sort of walkway and driveway here. This is the entrance. This is where you're supposed to come to the door back here. And then the maid whose room's up here comes down these steps and opens the door, etc. And then on that level, then you go up to the main living level. But the spaces down below here are like a billiard room and there's a children's playroom down here. This is the garage, car garage, which is now the gift shop. So this is the gift shop. And then this is the main living level here, which you see here with all these glass. You see all this glass along here, all this glass. Those are all doors. Every one of those is a glass door that can be opened onto a kind of small veranda area. And then dining room, kitchen, and then up this upper level up here, these are the bedroom levels up on the third level, or what we would call the second level. So here's the driveway. This is like looking this way into the entrance. So here's the main entrance. This is a private balcony. There's a guest bedroom here, right here on this main level. It has its own balcony. The prow of the ship, or what I think of as the prow of the ship, this is the living room, the main living room, and it ends in this beautiful design with this glass. And then there are two doors on either side that go out onto the balcony here, door here and a door here. Here's those bricks that we'll look at in a minute. Here's that cantilevered roof line that gives you this indoor-outdoor space. Here's the bricks. Just look at how long this bricks is. He also uses different colored grout. There's a white grout here on the horizontal, but a darker gray grout here on the vertical. Again, emphasizing the horizontality of it, making it sort of reach out.
Think of how much longer it took to build it.
Oh, yeah.
Using that.
Yeah, this is an expensive house. This is, it cost $58,000. This is an expensive house. I love this view. This is actually, the garage is over here on the right. It's kind of this corner right here. And what I love about it, and also this view, is this really complex massing of forms, these repetitions of rectangular forms and how they're massed and how they relate to one another. These are ideas that are going to be very important. When Frank Lloyd Wright wasn't actually here when this house was finished. He left some of his other people in charge of it. And he had taken these designs. He went to Europe in 1910 and toured Europe and did a lot of talks. And one of the buildings he talked about and brought the plans for was this building. And one of the people who, as a young student, heard Wright and saw this was Le Corbusier. So the influence of Wright on these young architects who are going to become the international style architects later is something that's never emphasized enough. Europeans don't like to acknowledge they got anything from America. They're disinclined to acknowledge that, but there is no question that they are influenced by Wright. Now, they're not doing Prairie style, they reject many aspects of his work, but nonetheless, they're certainly influenced by it. Now, let me see if I can find where that, okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. Moving on, interior. Again, very Japanese, low ceiling. He always paid attention to ceilings. He says most architects don't, and it's true. But he paid attention to ceilings, and it, again, emphasizes the horizontality because you feel that it does have a somewhat low ceiling. You're aware of that it feels a bit low. You can see the art glass on either side and all of the doors along the side. In the middle, between the living room and the dining room on the other side, is the fireplace. Here's, again, a traditional Japanese interior. The exposed wood is part of it as well. And you see that in the torii. Here's some of the art glass. You can buy all this art glass still online. If you want to put this in your house, you can do that. These are stylized candles, window light candles.
It's torture furniture.
Doesn't look that comfortable. No, I would agree. That never bothered Frank Lloyd Wright. He was not, that's not the point. And he would get very upset if you got rid of his furniture or even moved it.
He had a lot of built-ins, so you couldn't.
So you couldn't, right? Right. Yeah, no. Yeah, he was very controlling. And then, of course, the Kaufman House, Falling Water in Pennsylvania. There are a lot of stories about this, some true, some not, designed by him. A book came out in 1932, a very famous architectural book from Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, our Mies guy, who wrote a book together called Modern Architecture, and it was for an international exhibition in 1932. And they really attacked Frank Lloyd Wright because, I mean, you know, Philip Johnson built, you know, the Glass House. He was he was an international style architect, and they basically saw Wright as they called him an anachronistic, you know, out of his time. They were argumentary about his inability or his refusal to be influenced by other contemporary architects. They said he wasn't really modern. He was half modern and half romantic. And as much as they meant that as an insult, I actually kind of like it because I think they're right. What they're seeing is there are elements in his art that is like what they were doing, that to them was modern. You know, international style is modern. So that balcony there would be very modern. What they saw as romantic would be the way he's using stone because it's very tactile and very sensual. And I would absolutely agree. He is half. I don't agree he's half modern. I believe this is modern. It's just they were defining modern too narrowly. I would say this is modern, but I see where they're seeing the sort of romantic. Now, because of where this is, of course, we don't get the red brick. We get the beautiful limestone. And it's very intentional that this balcony is sort of concrete and very modern, you know, juxtaposed with this warm and sensual. That's what it's about, is that relationship. But this balcony is meant to mimic this big bedrock that sticks out. It's sort of, this is nature's, this is man's, and then the limestone merges the two. It was his idea to put it here. Kaufman wanted it on the other side of the valley so he could look at the waterfall. Wright says, well, why don't we just do it this way? And we can see some of again, the scale I think is deceptive. When you see some of these people, you get a sense of the scale a little bit more. Here, another view where you can see the waterfall. Inside, he's tying it more to the natural environment than he did even the Roby House, where we have this floor that mimics the natural bedrock. It's a poured floor that isn't bedrock, but it's left to look as if it were natural bedrock. And then the stonework, and particularly the ceilings, another good example of how he presents the ceilings. You can see them a little better here. The ribbon windows that now take up most of the space, and a lot of built-ins here. Here you can see the desk area with the beautiful horizontal stonework. This is the passage that leads down the steps to the waterfall, to the area that will lead to the waterfall. Had its own little access there to it. Now, one of the most well-known stories about this building that many people think is just apocryphal and probably not true is that after sort of weighing this around in his head and working on it for a long time, he finally gets a call from Edgar Kaufman, who says, I'm on my way. This was when he was still living in Madison. So he left Chicago. He says, I'm driving up to Madison. It's about 140 miles away. So say a couple of hours, I'll be there in a couple of hours. I want to see the plans. And Wright had no plans. He had written nothing down. He'd given it a lot of thought, but he had nothing. And so he says, okay, you know, we're ready. So he sort of runs in and he starts, you know, laying it all out. And his assistants are bringing him pencils, is going through pencils and drawing out all of this. It was like all in his head. Many people think that's not a true story, but that is a true story. There are at least 5 or 6 people who were there at the time that have verified that is exactly what happened. He had nothing down and he drew up the entire plan in 2 hours while Kaufman was driving out to the place. I love that story. It's an interesting story either way, but it really is a true story. And it shows you kind of how he worked, like in his head. And I'm going to show you my favorite Frank Lloyd Wright building, or maybe just one of them, but I certainly love this building. And this is the Johnson Wax building, a commercial building in Racine, Wisconsin. This is generally considered and has been on official lists as one of the 25 most important buildings in America. And I don't know whether they just mean, you know, commercial buildings as opposed to domestic architecture or not, but either way, it's stunning. This is the home, the international home of the Johnson Wax, and they wanted something like nothing else before, nothing else like it. And he gives them this structure with, again, special bricks were made, even curved bricks. These are bricks that are curved. And so there are 40 different patterns of bricks that had to be made so that it could be pieced together to give these rounded, these beautiful curvilinear forms that you can see here. Again, they're sort of massing together, but curving beautifully. He created this open rotunda inside the space that was unlike anything before. He designed probably 40 to 50 different pieces of furniture. These are all designed. He designed the desks and rolling file cabinets and all sorts of forms. The chairs are all his design. They're absolutely beautiful. And he used as a support system these sort of lily pad-like features. This is one of the cases where the architects told him, you can't do this. These won't hold the weight. And he did a study on his own of, I forget how many pounds, but he made one and it held like tons more weight than it needed to. And he proved the engineers wrong, that it clearly would support the weight. Here's some of the furniture. I love these desks and, you know, the rounded forms, they're all on wheels. This is new, the curved forms that slide out. Here's another one of the chairs. I see a lot of streamlined deco design influence here. I think this is strongly influenced by deco. The garage on the lower level, you can see there are 3 stories of these. These are the ones I think they said won't hold. I love this photo. I love old photos. I love it with the cars in the picture. And then lastly, his late part of his career, you know, people kept writing him off. People kept saying, well, no, you've had this huge, long career now, you know, your career's over. And then he comes back with another phase for another 25, 30 years, and they write him off. And then he has, you know, his last phase, and then he comes back. He's reborn. I mean, he's 70 years old when he enters his last phase of architecture design, and he's got still another 20 years to go on that because he never actually retired. The Guggenheim is certainly one of his most famous. There's another whole study that I don't want to get into too much about specifically museum design, because that's another whole thing. You know, in addition to architecture, it's a museum. So you're dealing with other issues, and people have different points of view, primarily whether a museum should be a work of art or should it be something more anonymous and the art is inside it? Should the building compete with the art in it? And there are different points of view. And the simple fact is many museums feel that buildings should be works of art themselves, but not everybody agrees with that. So, but he starts a tradition for Guggenheims because there are many Guggenheim museums in the world. And once he made this, now everyone who designs a Guggenheim has to live up to this or has to do something equivalent. And we're not really getting into postmodern architecture in this class, but certainly the Bilbao Guggenheim is the other most famous. That's revolutionary in its design, because he constantly, that's a Frank Gehry, who felt he was always in competition with this building. So as a designer, I like this old photograph because the building behind it does not exist yet. Today, you don't see it this way. It's primarily the rotunda area, and this was meant to be an exhibition space, but it's now like the bookstore and everything as a space. It was meant to stand out. Here's the sort of skyline, and obviously this stands out. Here's Wright. I think that might be Hillary Bay. I'm not sure. I think I know who those are. That's the first director. What was his name? I'll think of it later. With Wright and the original building. I'm sure you've been to the Guggenheim. Everybody's been to the Guggenheim. First thing to know about the Guggenheim: take the elevator up and walk down. Do not walk up the ramp. As much as it's a beautiful piece of architecture and really like a beautiful sculpture, it's not a great museum. It's really not good as a museum. These are terrible spaces to show art on those ramps. It's horrid. First of all, it's all sloping. It's a curving wall, and you can't stand back from anything. It's not, which is why they really ended up building the additional building to be a better space. You know, Brett, he didn't actually care. It's a beautiful building. When it was built, it was originally not open up here. It's later they did some changes to it and opened up and turned it into a skylight, but originally it was solid. And you couldn't have that wonderful kind of light. I can't even imagine.
When did they build that light?
This went in later. That's what I was looking for. 92, the skylight was restored. There was a period, I think originally it had it, and then they took it out, and then they restored it in 92. So I'd have to check the details again. I don't remember. Anyway, the reflected spiral is like a nautilus shell, and it is a beautiful space. It's a space to experience. Here is a modern view where you see the addition to the back, and now it becomes a functioning museum. But I'll never forget how disappointed I was with it the first time I saw it. Yeah, Dave?
Somebody pointed out when this was being built, I think, that he didn't like paintings, and that's true. And his
makes
and his
sense.
work, in his buildings, there were no paintings. There was glass.
Yeah, he made that amply clear.
A house near Chicago, I think it was just a really small one that was designed by him. And the guy who had it built and was there, and he said that he had to, he had to be concerned about glass and stuff, and he had to give up paintings.
Yeah, he clearly in this building. Yeah, Dave?
That puzzles me with, although I didn't know this, with Graham just shared. How could an architect be that short-sighted?
Oh, he wasn't short-sighted. He just didn't care. I mean, there's a difference between not knowing and not caring. He was an architect. He didn't think of function. I mean, many do, but he didn't. It was like a sculpture. It was a little jewel in space that you could go live in. But if you did, you had to live in it as he created it. I think he really did think of them almost more like sculpture than, because he doesn't have a typical architect sense of function. I mean, it's not like he didn't ever think of function, but how it worked sociologically with the person was more important for a domestic dwelling. Yeah.
There are, if you know more, tell me, but the church down at the bottom
Yeah.
of the hill in Kansas City. And then I've been in the house in Valentine. That's a gorgeous house.
No.
Never been at that one?
Is that
Okay.
for
And then the
the-
one up on the hill as you go to the airport, it's down the hill, and that's where he built all of that furniture. And the kitchen was just a long thing with not very much room in it. And those are the only three places in Kansas City that I know is Frank Lloyd Wright.
I've been in his home that he built for himself in Oak Park and the Roby House. He always built tiny bedrooms. He didn't believe there should be anything in a bedroom but a bed, and you didn't need more than like a foot on either side of it. Never. So he feels this way. So it doesn't matter what you feel.
Big living room.
Yeah, and no bedroom space.
I was in the Guggenheim when they did a retrospective Dubuffet. And it's perfect for that kind of thing, because you start at the beginning of his career.
And you follow it.
Follow it all the way.
If there's,
And it just made me a huge fan of Dubuffet, and
yeah, we're gonna look at Dubuffet actually the last day. Yeah, as long as they're not big paintings, so that you need to get back. I'm surprised somebody hasn't fallen over the railing trying to get back. But yeah, if their Dubuffets aren't that big, right? They weren't that
Some of
small.
them are quite
Some of
large, but they're abstract.
Right.
It's like, yeah, it worked.
It worked. That's all that matters, is that it worked. That is all I have for you on modern architecture. Does anybody have questions or comments on anything that we've talked about? Yeah.
Well, I was just in Phoenix and we went out to what is the name of it?
Taliesin West.
Taliesin West. And it's amazing because it's built on the side of a mountain, a little hill, big hill, huge hill. And he went out there like in 1930 or something, and he started, they didn't have transportation, and it's a long way from Phoenix. Well, Phoenix was a nothing town at that point in time. And it's built, and he had people come because
He had the Covenant. He had that even in Chicago before he went out to Taliesin. He liked being a kind of guru figure, that he had like dozens and dozens of these young architects. That's how his influences spread. Over his whole life, he would have influenced hundreds of young architects who then were so enamored of him that they went out and taught exactly what he taught. So all of our architectures,
they built that place.
there's hardly an architect working today, I understand, who isn't in a direct lineage to Frank Lloyd Wright, because it just filtered down. And yeah, it was like a commune out there. It was, they lived there. They had their own theater. It was like the Bauhaus. It was like the Bauhaus, except the students didn't build it. But yeah, it was an interesting place. It was very.
If anybody goes to Phoenix, be sure to go out
To
there.
Taliesin.
It's really worth it.
I saw it.
Yeah, I have not seen Taliesin West. I'd love to. Yeah. Yeah.
Peggy,
Yes.
I have a little anecdote that may or may not be apocryphal, but his brother was the minister at the Unitarian Church in Madison.
Right.
And so he talked him into building the church for them, designing the church for them. And then when it was through, his brother said, but why do you have all of this Trinitarian iconology there? He has 3 steps going up to the altar. He has 3 windows at the back. And Frank just said, I just like for you to remember where you came from. It was just a big joke to him.
Yeah. I wonder if he really even meant it.
I don't know. That's it. Like I say, it may be apocryphal. That's what they like to say up at Madison. I lived in Wisconsin for a long time.
Yeah.
And my friends in Madison tell that story.
Have you been out to Taliesin there outside Madison?
Yeah, I wasn't in good shape when I was there, but I was there. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you stumble over his stuff all the time.
Yeah.
The stuff, the one I like in Racine is that there's actually a building that looks like those light fixtures. We called it
Oh.
the ship.
Wow.
Outside the office building.
Cool. Cool. Okay, if there's nothing else, we'll call it a day. And next week we go back. Okay, next week we go back and start over. We go back to World War I, and now we're going to look at the other half. We've looked at constructivism. Now we're going to go back and look at like the fantasy art, Dada art, surrealism, the other side, the people that rejected the sort of rationalism of constructivism and embrace something entirely different. So see you then, everybody. Bye-bye. Yeah. Let me unshare.